I'm Al Filreis, and this is PoemTalk at the Writer's House, where I have the pleasure of convening three friends in the world of poetry to collaborate on a close but not too close reading of some poems. We'll talk, maybe even disagree a bit, and perhaps open up the verse to a few new possibilities, and we hope gain for poems that interest us some new readers and listeners. And I say listeners because PoemTalk poems are available in recordings made by the poets themselves as part of our Pen Sound archive, writing.upenn.edu/pensound. Today, I'm joined here in Philadelphia at the Kelly Writers House in our Wexler studio by James Berger, who teaches about apocalyptic literature and film, utopias and dystopias, historical fiction, disability studies, animal studies, whose books include, among others, The Obvious Poems and The Worthless Poems, Under the Impression, and The Disarticulate Language, Disability, and the Narratives of Modernity, and whose articles and essays include Propagation and Procreation, The Zombie and the Child, which appeared in a book on race, gender, and sexuality in post-apocalyptic TV and film, and traveled here to join us today, I found out recently, by car, not by train, from Yale University in New Haven, and by Sophia DuRose, poet, coordinator of our Kelly Writers House Fellows program, ex-circus performer from Central Florida. That's true. I'm not making that up. From Central Florida, and now a happy denizen, I think happy, of Philadelphia, who loves pugs and puns. An MFA candidate at Temple University, whose work has appeared in literary magazines such as Rainy Day Magazine, Revelry, National Poetry Magazine, Apricity, it's a magazine, and whose first book of poetry, Losing Teeth, was published by Shanti Press in 2019, and by Richard Deming, poet, art critic, and theorist, whose work explores intersections of poetry, philosophy, and visual culture. His collection of poems, Let's Not Call It Consequence, published by Shearsman, received the Norma Farber Award from the Poetry Society of America, whose book of poems, Day for Night, appeared in 2016, and who's the author of Listening on All Sides Toward an Emersonian Ethics of Reading and Art of the Ordinary, the Everyday Domain of Art, Film, and Literature and Philosophy. That's a book that I read, as you know, and who, like James, traveled here from New Haven to be with us today. You came together.
Richard drove.
And you drove. Richard, you drove. It's so good to see you. This is PoemTalk number 2 or 3? 3.
I've lost count.
Okay. You like it, though.
I love it. I think it's
I'm so glad.
National treasure, Al.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to cry.
Yeah.
Jim, first time to the Writers' House, I think. No? You were here once.
I seem to remember a conference. It was on disability and poetics, and Michael Davidson was here.
Michael Davidson was here. Yeah, it was here.
It was here. Yeah, that was exciting.
Oh, cool.
Orchid Tierney was here.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's great. Well, anyway, welcome.
Yeah,
and first time on PoemTalk. And Sophia DuRose, how many times? You've been on, for such a young upstart, you've been on PoemTalk a lot.
Yeah, I think this would be 3 or 4.
3 or 4.
Yeah.
You're so good. Thank you all. Well, today we 4 have gathered here to talk about 2 poems by Ron Padgett, The Austrian Maiden, a late poem or a later poem, and Joe Brainard's Painting Bingo. Our recording of The Austrian Maiden comes from a February 26, 2003 reading Padgett gave here at the Kelly Writers House, and I was in the room. The poem had just recently been published in Padgett's book, You Never Know, 2002. The recording of Joe Brainard's Painting Bingo, a poem published in Great Balls of Fire, 1969, comes from a November 20th, 1979 reading given at a location that is now sadly unknown. Not sure why, but it was a cassette we got and we couldn't figure out where it is. Maybe you guys can listen and you can remember that it was at the Ear Inn or somewhere else. The whole reading is up on Padgett's Pen Sound page. It came to us courtesy of the Maureen Owen collection of Greenwich Village poetry, now housed at, drumroll, the Yale Bonneke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, which several people in this room have a lot of heart in. So here now is Ron Padgett performing Joe Brainard's Painting Bingo and The Austrian Maiden.
This is called Joe Brainard's Painting Bingo. I have a friend named Joe Brainard. He's an artist. He did a painting called Bingo. Joe Brainard's painting Bingo. I suffer when I sit next to Joe Brainard's painting Bingo. I could have made that line into a whole stanza. I suffer when I sit next to Joe Brainard's painting Bingo. Or I could change the line arrangement. I suffer when I sit... Ooh, that sounds like hemorrhoids. I don't know anything about hemorrhoids, such as if it hurts to sit when you have them. If so, I must not have them, because it doesn't hurt me to sit. I probably sit about 8/15 of my life. Also, I don't suffer when I sit next to Joe Brainard. Actually, I don't even suffer when I sit next to his painting Bingo, or for that matter, any of his paintings. In fact, I didn't originally say, I suffer when I sit next to Joe Brainard's painting Bingo. My wife said it in response to something I had said about another painting of his. She misunderstood what I had said.
This is called the Austrian Maiden. Don't worry, I'm not upset about James Baldwin. I just have an old leaky nose. The Austrian Maiden. I wish I had blonde hair and was a maiden on a farm in Austria in the 19th century on a sunny day with rosy cheeks and blue eyes, just like those Nazi images of healthy farm girls. But are my great-grandchildren going to be monsters? Then I will have none. I will milk the cow and tell Hans and the others to keep their mitts off me. I will fill my evening hours with the sad music of Schubert and the sad poetry of Heine. It will be so beautiful.
Jim, I'm going to ask you, since you're the first timer, I'm going to ask you just to pick either poem to start with. But before that, I wonder if there's anything instantly that there seems so different, but is there anything that can connect them? Maybe it's just tone?
Yeah, a lot of the characteristic silliness of Ron, I think, is in both of them, but to very different effects. I mean, the idea of the hemorrhoids. They couldn't be hemorrhoids. Me? Hemorrhoids? I'm sitting down. I feel okay.
It's a shtick.
It's a shtick, and there's a lot of there's a lot of shtick, and a lot of it works very well. And we could, Austrian Maiden is probably. Richard and I were talking a little bit earlier. He was saying that Ron had said to him that he doesn't feel that comfortable reading it nowadays. I think is what you said.
The Austrian Maiden in particular.
Yeah, and I can understand that, and I think I don't know, especially at a current moment, I think it's difficult. With the Austrian Maiden, since we're there.
Okay, all right.
I don't believe that he wants to be an Austrian Maiden on a farm in Germany.
Does anybody who listens to it being performed or read it?
No.
It's not a plausible assumption.
It is not plausible. No. I think he knows that. He knows that everything in here. He knows that just one Austrian girl refusing to let Hans have his mitts on her is not going to make a difference in the future history of Germany and the world.
Right.
That he knows that, obviously. He also knows that the beauty of Schubert and Heine is not going to affect it either, because there already was the beauty of Schubert and Heine. And so this is an amazingly interesting performance to an effect that I actually don't quite know what the effect is supposed to be. There's something really funny about it, except I don't think it's that funny. Yeah. Whereas the other poem, I think, is actually really successful in the way that it puts forward this really serious thing.
Richard, pick up on the Austrian Maiden from what Jim was saying.
I think that, I want to talk about it, the way that it moves a little bit first, because I think it does begin in this way that I think is very characteristic of Ron's work, which is it almost doesn't feel like a poem. I think you hear that in the reading too. It feels like someone is setting something up. And so it can begin I wish I had blonde hair and was a maiden on a farm in Austria. And I think that's where it gets... I wish I had blonde hair. I wish I had hair. I don't have hair. Ron doesn't really have hair. And was a maiden. And I think that's actually really interesting now to think about him imagining. It's a kind of Whitmanian move to imagine oneself in a wholly different gender space. And then it becomes more specific on a farm in Austria. And then in the 19th century, and it's getting more and more specific in the 19th century, on a sunny day, with rosy cheeks and blue eyes, like all of that becomes much more, like the fantasy becomes much more precise and specific. And then we see where that image is coming from, those Nazi images of healthy farm girls. So that kind of propaganda picture is the thing that is setting up this kind of ideal of or idealized feminized beauty that he's not saying I want to have that or that's sexy. He's saying I want to be that, which I think is actually...
So we actually have to figure, if he doesn't really want to be it, I think we agree with that, Sophia, but he wants to try to figure out what that situation is, wants to understand the history of it, wants to understand what comes from it. Sophia, take us further on this, please.
Well, I also assumed they were both ekphrastic poems, which I thought connected them in terms, like, I assumed the maiden in question was like the Klimt painting.
Oh, wow.
And so obviously the second poem, Joe Brainard's painting Bingo, is about the painting too.
Right.
And I think also, like, when it comes to comedy, a key element of comedy is tension, creating tension and how you diffuse it. And I think these poems diffuse this tension differently, but there is a very obvious tension and like this shtick that he's creating for us.
Take us through the flow of the tension. I mean, to me, the question, but are my great-grandchildren going to be monsters, is probably meant to be funny, strikes us probably as not funny, but that is a very tense moment.
Yeah.
Because we think that the answer might be yes.
Well, I think that is a tense. I mean, it's a very tense moment, especially considering the line before it is like those Nazi images of healthy farm girls. And then to immediately think about what you could yourself create after invoking Nazi images and propaganda is tense and difficult. And then it bleeds into this conversation with literary and artistic influencers being influenced by someone instead of dealing with the idea of influencing someone, instead of dealing with the idea of what you could make. He's proposing being surrounded by things that have already been made.
Jim, let me try a too simple reading of the second half of this poem, and then you tell me where I've gone wrong or whether you like it.
Yes.
So if I inhabit the I of the 19th century Austrian Maiden, so 19th century proto-Nazi ideology, and one of the things that Nazi ideology would want, horrifically, would be for these maidens to produce new generations of supposedly racially pure people, which I hasten to say is bullshit. But so if Hans gets his mitts on this producer of a new generation that's going to lead to the 1930s and 40s, then the alternative is I want to spend my evenings not making babies for Hans or for the Reich, but to do something else, to listen to German music.
Yeah.
Right? How did I do on that? She's basically...
Well, that seems to be what the poem says. I mean, the question, don't we have to jump back to the question of can there be poetry after Auschwitz? I think let's go there.
Because
he just did one.
That's the context.
He just laid
did
one.
A poem.
Yeah, he did a poem after Auschwitz. It has to do with genocide. That's the obvious reference. And I'm thinking, okay, Ron, you're going there. Let's go there, and once you've gotten there, where are we exactly? And I guess the question is, can you tell? Well, of course you can. And I was going to say, can you tell jokes after Auschwitz? Well, we know you can. What could the producers? There's tremendous
Springtime
jokes
for Hitler in Germany.
Precisely,
I was thinking
precisely.
the same danger there.
Right. Martin Amos's Time's Arrow is a very funny book about the Holocaust. Or This Way to the Gas Chambers, ladies and gentlemen. I forget who wrote that one. A survivor.
Borofsky.
Yeah, right.
They're not very funny though.
Right. No, bad jokes. Yeah, I guess I think he just stepped off. He stepped off a ledge that I don't think he can pull himself back from on this.
Richard, help us out.
Yeah, so I'm glad that we got permission to disagree. I have a different take on this. Some of it is, I think Sophia's right, that it is an ekphrastic poem. But what he's really, in this particular poem, remember, it's the image of these healthy farm girls. So that propaganda, and, it was designed to be sexy and alluring and all of this kind of physical, attractive beauty. And you could imagine someone looking at that image and they're happy and they're rosy-cheeked and all of the markers of, a kind of idealized Western beauty are there. And you could find yourself saying, I wish I had blonde hair and I wish I was that beautiful and that alluring. And
could say no to bearing children?
I think that's where it happened, where he starts to say, just like those Nazi images of healthy farm girls, and that's when he says, if I'm going down this imaginative route, if I was one of those that I see in these images, would I have great grandchildren going to be monsters? And I don't actually think that's funny. I think that's kind of the associative move.
So the word then, Richard and Sophia, the word then means, and so, or as a result of that, I will refuse.
Exactly.
So it's a turn towards something more serious.
Yeah. I think it's a very melancholic poem that dealing with the repercussions or the sort of thinking through that fantasy is if this is it, then I would have to have that. And he's still, the speaker of this poem is still trying to bracket it off and, keep their mitts off of me. And there's that's also sexual violence. I mean, it's not necessarily a warm romantic courtship. And what is left then is the sad, beautiful music of Schubert and the sad poetry of Heine. It will be so beautiful.
And the last line has to be ironic. Bitterly,
I think,
bitterly
absolutely.
ironic.
Of course it's ironic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sophia, help us out. Where do you want to go with this before we turn to the other poem?
I guess in thinking about how this poem might be in conversation with the painting, the longer I look at the painting, the more bodies I can see in it. And,
Tell us more about the painting.
Well, it's like a circle of flowers and bright colors, and there's one girl's face that is really visible in the top part of it, but then the more you look at it, the more limbs you see, the more faces are kind of hidden, and it's circular and life cycle and fertility and all that stuff and ephemerality and beauty, youth essentially. And I don't know, the more you look at this painting, as I said, I feel like the more people I see in it. And so the line, but are my great-grandchildren going to be monsters? Then I will have none. It makes me think of stopping a lineage. And that can be read in many ways. The forced stoppage of generations and lineages, but also the refusal to participate in a system that might potentially stop other people's lineages. And so it just makes me think about generational trauma and the different ways you can respond to having it done to you.
Yeah, it's an interesting move for a poet to make so many years later, to think, I need to find out, at least for the moment, what it's like to be somewhere in the generation of the generational trauma. One can take that seriously as a strategy, even if one doesn't ultimately think it's successful because we don't know the tone. I know we're going to come back to this, so let's go to the other poem. Jim, you get to start. Where should we start?
All right. I guess what excites me about this poem is its movement, and its movement, as I was kind of spelling out a little bit before, from this, it seems to be a poem in 4 acts. The first act is the existential pronouncement. I suffer when I'm by the painting. The second is the formal rearrangement that subtracts the emotional investment. I mean, the first line, which is its stanza, is, hugely emotional. Then, when it's cut up, it's minus that emotion. I suffer when he's doing a little formal game. Then the third section is absurdity and silliness, which is something Ron loves and is good at. The silly insertion, the hemorrhoids. And finally, the complete reversal and reimagining through the misunderstanding. I don't suffer when I sit next. I don't even suffer when I'm sitting next to any painting. In fact, I didn't even say it. It was a misunderstanding. And so there's this, I think, lovely sense of a kind of a poetics of the action of the poem never really ultimately makes it into the poem. It's always something else elsewhere. And it reminds me a little of Frank O'Hara's very famous poem on Why I'm Not a Painter.
It's kind of a New York school
I guess you're right.
style here because of that.
Yeah.
Richard, take us further in this.
Well, I think it is interesting to think of a poem like this in contrast to the heavy modernists, which were really dominant as Ron was born in 1942, and so the heavy modernism is going to be something that's very big in his imagination. And so sort of extending the New York school's move into allowing for different kind of textures and tonalities to enter into a poem so that something could be like your friend Joe Brainard's painting Bingo. And when he writes and publishes the poem, people don't know who Brainard is. Now he's, very expensive painter, hard to get a hold of his work. But here he's very, it's very insidery. I think it would still be hard to assign to a workshop, write a poem in which hemorrhoids appear. It's a difficult word to get in there and still kind of have control of the poem. And I think that's one of the things that I like about the poem is that it is, it's very meta. He says, I suffer when I sit next to Joe Brainard's painting Bingo. I could have made that line into a whole stanza. Of course it is. It's a one-line stanza. And then he breaks it in a kind of, typical verse way. And then it continues to think through the arrangement of it. But I think also just the fact of trying to let this kind of language into a poem and still – so the meta isn't just navel-gazing. It's a kind of demonstration of we're thinking about this in terms of poetic form. And so if I'm demonstrating that I'm super aware of that, then my ability to bring in things that are, decidedly anti-poetic and still control this as a poem, even though it feels like just barely over the line. That's the thing that I most love about Ron Padgett's work is that it so often feels like there's that old line, is that a real poem or did you just make it up, that Creeley named an essay after, and James Wright had heard it at a reading. And I think that's where Ron Padgett's work really falls. That idea is what makes this language poetic if it is so everyday, if it is so gentle in its tension. And I think that is one of the reasons that this works so beautifully.
That's great. As I turn to you, Sophia, let me just throw out kind of an obvious New York school thing, which is it's ironic when a poet who loves painting writes a poem about admiring a painting and starts by saying, I suffer when I consider the painting about which this poem is. So let's take seriously for a second that maybe the poet is suffering. I mean, if Frank O'Hara suffers when he's next to a painting, it's because he, for the moment, thinks he can't do as well, do all the fun stuff, the pyrotechnics, and then always winds up doing it, which is happening here. So let's just consider seriously for a moment what it's like for a poet to suffer when sitting next to a painting. Is that a fair question?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah. I think characteristic of a lot of New York school type of poetry is attention and how attention is used in your life and in your observations. And this poem, it made me think of when I was younger and I'd go to my grandmother's assisted living facility and I'd play bingo with her. And I had
with a large group.
Yes, but I had a complete inability to pay attention to the actual game, and the only thing on the board I could ever get was the free space, because that's just in the middle and you get it no matter what. So I was thinking about attention and what the free space of this poem would be. And because the free space is in the middle, I naturally looked at the middle of the poem. And I feel like it's the line, "I suffer when I sit," which means that the universal common element of this poem that everyone should be able to get is "I suffer when I sit." And I think the suffering there is what draws my attention in multiple ways, but I think that's like this universal common ailment of people is to suffer, right? And artists.
That. Jim, what are you thinking?
Yeah, the suffering, yes, but the suffering's not in the poem, though. It's somewhere else. I mean, there may be. I mean, this poem puts suffering as its subject, but actually it's a misunderstanding. And so clearly there's suffering and there's death. And there's this great poem of his called Death, which you may know, in which he says, I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to know about it. Don't talk about it. And then it kind of comes in. There's a weird, it ends with like a barber giving a bear a haircut. And it's kind of delightful.
Let me interrupt.
Yeah.
Sorry. I love the use of "also" here in this poem. Also, yes. I don't suffer when I. That also, which people use in conversation, is very hard to put in a poem as significantly as is here. Also, and by the way, you read this poem halfway through, and that premise was also, I don't actually suffer.
Right. In point of fact. Yeah. I also, going back to what Richard's saying, the anti-seriousness of Padgett's poetry, I think, is really remarkable. And his sense, Kenneth Koch in his poem Fresh Air is, very much about the seriousness of contemporary poetry. Who are the great poets of our time? Yeats, of the baleful influence. Auden, of the baleful influence. And I think the sense that I am opposed to poetry of the baleful influence is very much part of Padgett's project here, and I think most places, that there can be poetry that is both about these serious things, but yet in an oblique way. So it's curious, yeah.
I suffer when I sit next to Joe Brainard's painting, Bingo. I could have made that line into a whole stanza. I suffer when I sit next to Joe Brainard's painting, Bingo. Or I could change the line arrangement. I suffer when I sit, ooh, that sounds like hemorrhoids. Richard,
what is painterly, if anything, about the poem? Or what is Bingo like, if it is about the poem? I just asked you two ridiculous questions, and you had something else you wanted to say. I think there is something Bingo-like about the poem, but there's definitely something painterly about the poem. It wouldn't be. I'm actually looking at an image of the Bingo painting, or at least one of them. So I'm thinking something more abstract would work for the way this poem gets so meta. But anyway, I ask the questions, and you can ignore them or try to answer.
Well, one biographical thing I will say that he really did have that above his desk as he wrote and would look at it every day.
Bingo.
Yeah. And
so this is really a poem about the thing that gets me to write poems, and this is a poem that's arguably about getting started to write a poem and undoes itself.
Yeah, I think that's like
a warm-up.
It's in the way that Brainard is very often a collage artist. He's working with collage, which does both assemble but reveal the assemblage. And I think that you get to see him working out the poem. Again, I suffer when I sit next to Joe Brainard's painting Bingo. I could have made that line into a whole stanza. And so then he makes it into a line, into a stanza, a verse. I suffer, which does feel existential in 1960. I suffer when I sit.
He makes it suddenly very serious, very New American, very Creeley-esque. I suffer.
Exactly.
When I sit next to Joe Brainard's painting Bingo. There's my bingo. But
yeah.
He got bingo. But anyway, I interrupted you. I'm
Bingo.
sorry.
Or it could be read because of the lack of punctuation. I suffer. When I sit next to Joe Brainard's painting Bingo, like it could go in that direction, which we feel something big building. And then he gets to, or I could change the line arrangement. I suffer when I sit, and then it moves. He breaks himself off.
Yeah.
That's a dumb line. That sounds like hemorrhoids. Like that is something that when you're writing, you like, especially a line that has this built-in drama. You know, Levertov talking about the first beat and the last beat always getting this kind of drama.
Right.
And he interrupts that and then starts thinking, staying on that line and thinking about the hemorrhoids and what he does or doesn't know about them. And then you're right. Also, I don't suffer.
Also, in fact, the whole premise of this poem is screwed.
My life is actually not so bad. And I think something worth mentioning, too, here at the end is the, how this is also anti or non-monumental, and that he brings in Pat Padgett, his wife, and says, actually, that great line that this began with, the whole thing that I didn't say.
Misunderstanding.
Yeah. Pat said it, and she said this great line that I then wanted to take and make a poem out of.
Sophia, I'm sure that you were going to go to say more about this poem, but I'm going to throw you a curveball. The playfulness and the self-generating quality of the Bingo poem and the communality that Richard's talking about, it really makes us feel that the poem is always leaning toward a little bit of poet voice seriousness and then retreats from it to indifference to all the mixing and confusion and fun. It's hard to imagine that this same poet wrote the Austrian Maiden. So I guess I'm going to invite us all, starting with you, either to reconcile the two poems, earlier and late, or to say this is the same poet, or somewhere in between the two.
I don't think I think it makes sense that the same poet wrote both these poems. I don't really know how, but...
Yeah, well, get us started.
Well, I wanted to offer...
Someone chose these poems at opposite ends of the collected poems of Ron Padgett. How many pages?
600.
700
It's a lot
pages.
of pages.
Although Austrian Maiden is only about page 426 out of 7 or something.
782.
It's later. It's later.
It's later.
Same poet. Mm-hmm. Richard, let us reveal, I think, picked the two poems. Yeah. So, I guess we're going to go in a circle and you'll get to say why. But this is such an interesting poem talk conversation because it does potentially feel like two different poets. But I think, taking a cue from what Jim said at the very beginning, when we talked about the two, some of the strategies are the same. The tactics are the same. The topic affects the one.
I think on the level of the line, they both make sense as New York school. I do this, I do that. I won't have kids. I will suffer. I don't suffer. I think there is a matter-of-factness about just the language decisions in both the poems. I think there's also strange contradictions that make sense in both of them. Mm-hmm. And I did want to say, in answer to your question of how's it bingo like, that I could have made that line into a whole stanza, and then to break it into a stanza of 5 short lines is like a winning bingo card.
It is a winning bingo card.
On the level of a line,
and there
it
is
looks like
one word, pretty much, that would defy poet voice. Bingo is a word that cannot, because I think bingo is not just from your childhood with your grandma, putting the things, whatever it is that you put little discs on there, chips.
There was a farmer had a dog.
Yes. Well, it's that, and also it's eureka, bingo.
Sure. Right.
Bingo. And there's a lot of eureka in the self-referentiality of this poem. Okay, Jim.
Yeah.
So it's not connected to poems. It's like, what can a poem talk be about two very different strategies by the same poet?
Yeah. I guess I could say a couple of things. One is that one thing Ron likes to do occasionally is be a little bit transgressive. The Austrian Maiden, he knows this is a touchy subject. It may indeed be as Richard interpreted it. I'm not sure, but whatever it is, it's a touchy subject, and he knows that. He knows that. There are some other kind of odd lines which I found in my readings of him. In Wonderful Things, there's a line, "As if I had become a helpless moron," and there's some things we could say about that, but it's an odd choice of word. Even then, because this was back, this is not in contemporary disability politics, but even then, it was not a word that one would necessarily use for a cognitively impaired person. It's a little bit of transgression. He likes that. Sometimes I wonder, there's whimsy, there's silliness, and how much whimsy is too much whimsy, and how much anti-seriousness is too much anti-seriousness. So there's that. The other thing I would say very quickly is there is a kind of poetics that I kind of locate in a poem, one of his best poems, I think it's called Bunchberries in the Tulsa Kid, 1979. And he says, "I think everything is intimately connected, touches every other existent thing simply by existing also. I breathe along the path, you see what I mean." So I'll stop there, but there's a little more to it, which is also interesting. So I think so that poetics, I think, does inform a lot of what he does. This little bit of edge to his poetry. What can I get away with? What word can I use that people are going to know is wrong, but you know what? I'm going to do it anyway. And I just think the whole Austrian Maiden poem, contra Richard, I think the whole poem is that.
Richard, it's your turn. There's so much you can respond to, and maybe you can throw in there what you were thinking when you decide these are the two poems.
Well, I think I wanted to show a range, and I really think that the last 15 years, his work has been just phenomenal. I don't know another poet that handles writing about mortality the way that he does, in a kind of without a kind of drama to it, but also not underplaying it. It's incredibly gentle, and it has this feel of him spending his whole life developing this really light touch to be able to take on the heaviest of subjects, death, in a way that isn't heroic or suffering, but is also not praising it, and isn't, a Whitmanian redemption of death. And so I think that something like Austrian Maiden is something that is moving in that direction, which is it moves gently into something really sad and dark and complicated, and I think that is really what it really takes. It takes all of that energy to make something look as effortless as that. And so some of the play of some of his poems really sets up that kind of later move. And I think that is one of his tonalities. I mean, it is through his body of work. He's somebody who can make people laugh. He can make people at the Beinecke Library. He's the only poet who I see actually get laughs out of people.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Beinecke's very serious.
It's very serious. Some of the funniest poets.
It's that architecture.
The Gutenberg Bible was grinning.
Yeah. I mean, dear Charles Bernstein has read there, and I've seen
no laughs.
Charles kill across the country. And Beinecke, no.
Well, you're really throwing some shade here.
It's just a tough
Yale
room.
audience.
It's true.
You guys
It's
are
true.
serious.
Can I just say, Richard and I had a little email exchange over the summer when we first discovered, it's going to be Ron Padgett, and I wrote to Richard, I didn't know about this. I got a lot of reservations about this kind of just this silliness, and I was thinking Richard would agree. He says, Jim, to me, Ron Padgett is a genius, and it was wonderful.
I totally love that. I may have cut you off. Did you were thinking further?
Just saying that his ability to kind of move in between these really, really subtle changes while also being funny. Like, it's not like he has one move. I think it's the one that gets the most attention is his funniness, because it is, when he hits, he really hits.
Yeah.
But I think it's really, like for me, the best comics, it's really the sadness underlying it that really is what gives it a kind of texture and shading that makes something really last. And I think I just think it is very easy to do what Ron Padgett does in most of his poems badly. And it is impossibly hard to do it the way he does it, which is as if, like I said, it's just barely over into the world of being a poem, and still, for me, often works.
I want to say something about that. I don't know how this is going to come out, but it follows from something you said. You didn't say the word prepositions, but you did talk earlier about the way in which the specificity increases in the beginning of the poem, and that's what I want to say. The strategy here is an unusual strategy for him, which is to get very, very increasingly specific, which has to be ironic because that's not his approach typically. But I think he gets stuck in it. And the but that comes, I'm going to read it so you'll hear it, but the but that comes is a but that says, the strategy of this poem has locked me into a very particular weird fantasy. And it's very specific, and it is leading me to proto-fascism. And the but is, okay, how am I going to get out of this? As if the speaker is the progenitor of the generations that will cause genocide. I wish I had blonde hair and was a maiden on a farm, first preposition, in Austria, the ground zero of anti-Semitism, more anti-Semitic than Germany, in the 19th century, now where we're going, on a sunny day, with rosy cheeks, etc., then the reference to images, and then but. And the but seems to me a meta but. It's a but that says, it's not quite as hilarious as also I don't suffer. The whole premise of the poem is not what I meant. But this but gets very serious. But I'm fooling around. I'm a tomfoolery kind of poet. Now I'm dealing with some pretty difficult stuff, as we've all acknowledged. And now the but is, what's going to happen to this poem? And then I'm going to have to be in a position, having inhabited a gender that is already a kind of a controversial move for a comic poet, and I'm going to have to put Hans off, and I'm going to have to do something that is going to prevent the future of mass death. And this can the over-specificity of the beginning of this poem stand? And he obviously chose to let it stand and to risk that he couldn't or could be the Houdini comic poet that you're describing to get himself out of this one. And I find it moving, actually, that he put himself in this position and then kept the poem and read it here at the writer's house when I was sitting in the room. Okay, wow. I don't know how I feel, but we're going to go around for final thoughts, and we'll see how it goes. So, Sophia, what is your final thought?
I would like what you just said about how he handles mortality. You said without drama. I thought that was really interesting. And I was thinking about this line in the Bingo poem. I probably sit about 8/15 of my life, which I think is a funny thing to say out loud because 8/15 is such a random number. Like, it's about 53%, and it's so specific, and it just strikes me as something that I don't read often in poems, but I also read it kind of maybe as a code to this idea of the contradiction between suffering and not suffering. Like, I suffer about 8/15 of the time. I don't suffer about 8/15 of the time. And I think that's actually like not funny at all when I view it in that, when I view it like that, and when I use that as a code to read this poem and how serious he's being or how misunderstood he feels sometimes.
Thank you. Jim, final thought?
Oh, goodness. I've numerous. We didn't, Richard and I Richard suggested that we not talk. I said Patterson, the movie Patterson, which is, I think, such a beautiful movie, such a kind of perfect movie about poetry in a certain way. And his poems work so precisely, nicely there as these attentive, loving, funny, not, but anti-transcendent. And yet,
and daily, I guess.
Daily, exactly.
In the
exactly.
narrative of that film.
Exactly. And yet, as Richard points out, no, he does so much more. I mean, they are perfect for that. But I got to kind of immerse myself, a little in just a wide range of his work, and I'm just very happy to have done so.
That's nice.
Yeah.
That makes me happy. Richard, final thought.
Ron Padgett, genius. I think I do think that's. I think one of the things that I really admire is that it is, again, this sort of non-romantic, non-monolithic image of a poet. That it isn't a muse that passes through, but that it's our daily life that moves through, and that anything can generate poetry, and anything can be susceptible to poetry, because all of it is language, and sometimes that'll be suffering, and sometimes that will be beautiful, and sometimes the suffering will be beautiful, and sometimes the beautiful will be suffering. But at the bottom, it's poetry.
Mm-hmm. Makes me think of sit next to. Sit becomes hilarious because it's a hemorrhoids thing, and sitting a lot of the day, presumably, at a desk. But sit next to a painting, sit next to art. If you sit next to something, that's collage, that's juxtaposition, that's what the art of the second half of the 20th century and certainly beyond is all about. And this epitomizes it. And it produces the generative quality, sorry for the cliche, but that's what this is, of the Bingo poem. It's so generative. It just, it's like, I can do this. I can make a poem. I can make a poem out of this. Now I'm going to make a poem out of this. And what strikes me about the other poem is that it tries to be, it is generative in thinking, I have this fantasy, it's very specific, I'm going to make, but it turns out topically and thematically to be anti-generative. It's against the production of a generation and generations, so that the trauma of hemorrhoids is funny, but the trauma of this person somehow knowing in the 19th century that she should not create generations it's like the origin of our modern problem. Mm-hmm. And that he would go there is just stunning to me. I don't know how he did it.
And it produces monsters and Schubert. That's that's the complication there.
And that the solace that I seek is this beautiful music. And beautiful doesn't have to be ironic.
Schubert's still there. Schubert's there.
Yeah, I mean, we still listen to Schubert like we still...
Damn straight.
Like we still drive Volkswagens. Sorry. Oy. Well, we like to end Poem Talk with a minute or two of Gathering Paradise, which is a chance for several of us to, or all of us, if you're quick, to spread wide our narrow Dickinsonian hands to gather a little something really poetically good to hail or commend someone or something going on in the poetry world or the art world or the dance world or film world. Jim, you have something?
Yeah, well, it's old. It's really old. It's about 10th century Islamic sect called the Brethren of Purity. It's a little volume called The Case of the Animals versus Man in the Court of the Jinn. The animals are tired of being subject to human beings, and they bring up a lawsuit to liberate themselves, and they bring it to the king of the genies because no human court will hear them. And it is just the most beautiful, spiritually profound, and profoundly cosmopolitan pieces of writing that I've ever read. They are knowledgeable about every religious tradition, from Judaism and the Christian Gospels to Sanskrit texts, and they're all good. It's Moses, the saying in Islam is, Muhammad, peace be upon him, Moses, peace be upon him. And I think at our moment right now, this is the book that everyone should read.
Wow. Richard, how are you going to follow that?
Just read it. That's all.
I'm going to talk about a sitcom. No, I think I want to talk about James Agee, Death in the Family. Mid-50s, he won the Pulitzer for it, which nobody reads anymore. And I was working on something on Walker Evans and started reading James Agee, and Les Perry's Famous Men is a masterwork. But I read Death in the Family, which is just this beautiful and I think really unique. Have you read it?
Yes, I have.
Did you like it?
A sad, beautiful book.
Absolutely,
Beautifully
yeah.
written. I read it in grad school.
Absolutely. It's kind of biblical, and it's this long meditation of grief, but not post-grief, but as it's unfolding. And when you go through grief, like it deals with both the moments of banality and distance and great heartache, and it's kind of in real time. It's really unique, and it's been haunting me for months.
Wow,
now.
James Agee has not been recommended in Gathering Paradise before. Sophia, what would you recommend?
Well, I was going to go with Evie Shockley's Suddenly We, because it's also mainly ekphrastic. But I just read it last week, and I loved it. I thought it was beautiful, and I thought it was I could sit with each page for a really long time. I didn't have that time when I was reading it last week, but I'd like to make that time. I think it was also just shortlisted for a National Book Award. I know it was longlisted. Yeah. So I'd recommend that.
Evie Shockley. That's a great suggestion. And I will say, for PoemTalk listeners and fans, episode number 200 is going to feature a discussion of the poetry, a couple of poems by Evie Shockley. So I'm very excited about that.
I'm psychic.
You are psychic. My Gathering Paradise is just to read a poem that I really like from the collected poems of Ron Padgett on page 237, and it's a meta poem. It's called Poem. I'm in the house. It's nice out. Warm sun on cold snow. First day of spring or last of winter. My legs run down the stairs and out the door. My top half here typing.
Yeah. All right.
Well, that's all the not knowing anything about hemorrhoids we have time for on PoemTalk today. PoemTalk at the Writers' House, a collaboration of the Center for Programs in Contemporary Writing, Penn Sound, the Kelly Writers' House, the University of Pennsylvania. Thanks so much to my guests, James Berger, Sophia DuRose, and Richard Deming. And thanks also to PoemTalk's directors and engineers today. 3 of them, Zach Cardner, Magda Andrews-Hoke, and McKenna Devereaux. And to PoemTalk's editor, the same amazing Zach Cardner. To consult all 194 episodes of PoemTalk dating back to 2007, please go to poemtalk.org. We post the audio recording of each episode, of course, but also program notes, photographs of the PoemTalkers, relevant links to Penn Sound and elsewhere, and sometimes a video of the session. PoemTalk is also available through most podcast apps and sites, so check us out and subscribe and leave us a review. Next time on PoemTalk, I'll be joined by Julia Block, Jonathan Dick, and Gabby Ojeda-Segay to talk about Hart Crane's The Harbor Dawn and performed by, because we don't have Hart Crane recordings, performed by, anybody want to guess? Tennessee Williams.
Oh.
Performs The Harbor Dawn. This is Al Filreis, and I hope you'll join us for that or for another episode of Poem Talk.